We can go ahead. Hi, everyone. My name is Lena Scalaban. I'm a fourth-year graduate student at Yale University. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon for the next talk in the Innovators in Cognitive Neuroscience speaker series with Dr. Tatiana Lau. Before beginning, we want to acknowledge the indigenous lands for which we are joining today's talk. I'm speaking to you from New Haven, Connecticut, marked in name by the Quinnipiac, Pagaset, and Wakajinner people. Please use the link I'm about to send through the chat to research and reflect on the indigenous lands from which you are joining us. Through the acknowledgement of past harms, we step towards a more equitable and humane future. On behalf of the students and postdocs and organizing committee, I'm excited to welcome you all to today's Innovators in Cognitive Neuroscience seminar. The organizing committee together represents a consortium of colleagues and universities, including Dartmouth, UPenn, Yale, MIT, Princeton, Harvard, Columbia, and Gallaudet that are committed to highlighting advances in cognitive neuroscience research. We acknowledge the privilege of these institutions, and we wish to make the science discussed here available and accessible far beyond the ivory tower of academia. With the consent of our speakers, we plan to make these talks publicly available on our website and seminars open to anyone interested. A quick note to those of you who are new to the series, after the talk is over, we'll move to a new Zoom room for the Q&A that I'll post in the chat in just a moment. This is a space for anyone to ask additional questions to Dr. Lau that were answered during the talk, as well as do a bit of a growing up in science to ask Tatiana any questions about her life as a scientist. I'm about to post the link into the chat and we'll post it once more when the presentation is concluded. And with that, I will turn it over to Chi to introduce Dr. Lau.
Hi everyone, my name is Chi Lin and I'm a graduate student at Yale, and I'm super excited to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Tatiana Lau. Dr. Lau received her bachelor's degree in economics from Princeton University. She completed her PhD in Mina Cikara's lab at Harvard University, where she was also affiliated with the Institute for Quantitative Social Science. After graduating from Harvard in 2019, she joined the Department of Psychology at Royal Holloway, University of London as a lecturer, the equivalent of an assistant professorship in the United States. Dr. Lau's research program focuses on understanding how we learn social group boundaries and categorize others as we encounter them into us versus them, and the downstream consequences of such categorization in how we interact with others. She employs a diversity of tools to tackle these important questions, including computational modeling, fMRI, behavior experiments, and observational data sets. She has published in top journals such as JAP General, Psych Science, eLife, Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, and etc. This research program strikes me as utterly important and particularly relevant in today's increasingly diverse but also polarized society. Like me, I'd imagine Dr. Lau probably won't have much of a hard time explaining to her family members at the dinner table about why she's studying this. Not to say that I don't find my own research interesting and important, but it's harder for my aunts and uncle to get it as opposed to Dr. Lau's research. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Lau to tell us more about her work on discovering social groups via latent structured learning. And I will stop sharing and then so that she can share her slides.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chi, for that wonderful introduction. Hopefully it's sharing. Okay, great. Thank you so much again to the organizers for organizing this amazing series. It's really an honor to be a part of this and be amongst these wonderful people who have already presented ahead of me. And so, yeah, let's get started. So before we get started, I guess I want to just highlight the cause for this week. And so the cause is ALIGHT. It's formerly known as the American Refugee Committee. And you can find out more about them here. They provide humanitarian aid in the form of, shelter, food, and aid to refugees and displaced peoples. And so I just want to highlight some numbers, I guess, from the most recent UN HCR Global Trends Report, which basically at the end of 2019, they estimated that almost 80 million people were forcibly displaced worldwide. And this represents 1% of the world's population. And if we break it down, we can see that this is, the breakdown here, over half of these are internally displaced people. And furthermore, if we look at historic trends, we can basically see that this number has been rising, more or less since 2012, right? And so, my point here is that in the middle of a pandemic, it's easy to forget about the troubles of others who live far away, but I wanted to highlight this because I think it's important to remember, that a lot of these people are displaced from their homes and or trying to leave unsafe environments, often because of the legacy of Western colonialism. And this includes hierarchies and social structures and social groups that were imported and imposed by colonizers. And, some of these are similar to the ones that we're still trying to change today. But, this legacy of Western colonialism has had a very lasting effect and continues to disrupt people's lives in parts of the world. And so I want to start off the main part of this presentation with a quote. And this quote comes from a press conference after last week's shootings in Atlanta, in which 6 of the 8 victims were women of Asian descent. So as we all know by now, the shooter was a white man. And during the press conference following his arrest, and this was the day after the shooting, the sheriff's spokesperson, this guy, says this about the shooter. He, the shooter, was fed up, kind of at the end of his rope. And yesterday was a really bad day for him. And this is what he did. And this gained a lot of reactions of incredulity because we can all easily imagine the counterfactual, right? Which is that if the shooter had been a person of color, this statement would have looked very, very different. And I think this quote nicely emphasizes, the role of groups and how social groups and memberships in these groups are important because they change our expectations of and views of and attitudes and behaviors towards people when we view them as members of groups rather than as individuals. In an increasingly interconnected world, as Chi mentioned in the intro, in diversifying society, we're encountering new people all the time. So how might we be categorizing new others into us and them? How do I know who is with me and who isn't? So previous research focused on using explicit groups. So for example, groups based off of gender or skin tone, or groups based off of explicit labels, right? So knowing that everybody else in my group was also a Pats fan. Of course, this isn't to ignore the very important research coming out of the intersectionality literature, which moves us beyond single group identities by acknowledging that we all are more than any one single social group identity, and that the discrimination that we face cannot be viewed solely through the lens of a single group membership. But of course, taking all this into account, there's still some problems with the existing research. So the identity that we bring to bear in any situation is context dependent. And second, we don't always have salient cues to others' group memberships. So taking this into account, like how do we gather information to infer us and them? How do I learn who is us and who is them? So one account, if you were in a room with Annie, Betsy, and Carol here, is that you could rely on dyadic similarity with each person in the environment to understand your relationship to each person. So in other words, the way that you perceive Annie is a function of your similarity to Annie. How you perceive Betsy is a function of your similarity to Betsy. And how you perceive Carol is a function of your direct similarity to Carol. On the other hand, an alternative approach that builds on top of this is one in which you also think about how Annie, Betsy, and Carol each relate to one another. And then you integrate across all of this information to infer latent structures amongst people in the environment. I'm going to take a moment now and just give you slightly more concrete examples of what I'm talking about. So under dyadic similarity, you know, if you were in a room with Annie and Betsy, what you're trying to do is you're trying to keep a running tally of how often Annie and Betsy are similar to you. So how often they want to watch the same movie as you. And how you perceive Annie and Betsy at the end is simply a function of their, you know, each person's similarity to you. On the other hand, under a latent structure learning account, what this account is saying is that we're gathering information from the environment to gauge what the most probable latent grouping is across multiple individuals. And so again, if it was just you, Annie, and Betsy in that room, what you're trying to do is that you're trying to understand what possible which grouping, sorry, out of all of the possibilities is the most likely, given the information that you have about them, right? So is it the case that maybe you, Annie, and Betsy are in 3 separate groups? Or maybe it's the case that Annie and Betsy are in one group together without you? Or maybe it's the case that you, Annie, and Betsy are all in one group together. And we can set a prior over all of our groupings by using a Chinese restaurant process prior, which basically tells us, you know, the probability of any of these groupings. And we have a hyperparameter here, alpha, which is just our dispersion parameter, which is going to, you know, govern the likelihood of assigning somebody to a new group. And so basically, as we accumulate more information about Annie and Betsy, so again, how often they want to watch the same movie as us, we can use Bayes' rule to update our posterior over all possible groupings to finally understand what the most probable grouping is given the information that we have. Of course, Bayes' rule is just a normalized product of a prior and a likelihood. I've given you the prior here, but I still have to give you the likelihood. And so our likelihood is going to be derived from analytically marginalizing the latent parameters of a Dirichlet multinomial model. And so what this is saying here is just that we're going to assign higher likelihoods to groupings where people who exhibit similar behavior are assigned to the same group. And then we're going to test between these 2 accounts by asking you to choose between Annie and Betsy. So for example, whom do you trust more? With whom would you ally? Whom do you find more competent or moral? And what we're going to do is that we're going to make Annie and Betsy equally similar to you. And then we're going to vary the level of similarity between yourself and a 3rd agent, Carol. And Carol is really important to our story here because Carol is kind of drives the divergence between the 2 accounts' predictions. So under dyadic similarity, the placement of Carol in this agreement space shouldn't affect how you perceive Annie or Betsy, because again, how you perceive Annie and Betsy is simply a function of their respective similarities to you. On the other hand, under a latent structure learning account, the placement of Carol does matter, such that if I, the experimenter, make Carol very similar to you and more similar to Betsy than to Annie, you would infer that the most probable latent structure is one that includes yourself, Carol, and Betsy. And so this would make you more likely to choose Betsy over Annie when asked to choose between the 2 of them. For the sake of shorthand, I'm just going to call this the high C agreement condition going forward. And whenever I say high C agreement, I just am referring to instances where I, the experimenter, have made Carol very similar to you. Of course, as the experimenter, I could also make a low C agreement condition, and I can do this by making Carol very dissimilar to you. So Carol disagrees with you a lot. Of course, you're still trying to infer what the most probable latent structure is, but now it looks like it's one in which Betsy and Carol have run off to form a group without you. And this would make you more likely to choose Annie over Betsy as a result. I'm going to walk us through the test that people did. So we told participants that they were learning about the preferences of 3 other agents relative to themselves. You'll notice that I've used the names Annie, Betsy, and Carol here again, and this is to allow us to map this task onto the examples that I provided earlier. These are just toy names. In reality, we use a variety of names and faces. Of course, you know, I should also note here that we did use all white faces and names, and these faces were matched for attractiveness and prototypicality. And this is so that we could get a cleaner estimate of our effect here. And we wanted participants' behaviors to depend only on what they were learning about the individuals rather than on the individuals' races. And in the future, we're hoping to understand this more fully with a more diverse set of faces and names that vary along racial and gender lines. And so, right, so I told you so far that participants are learning about these 3 other agents' preferences, and specifically they're learning about the agents' preferences on different political issues, which we took from isidewits.com, which is basically a website where people answer questions about different political issues and learn about which political candidate they align with the most. But for our purposes, it provides us with a lot of different political issues to use. And so participants saw a range of issues ranging from whether or not producers should be required to label genetically engineered foods, to whether or not the Fed should be audited by Congress, to whether or not employers should be required to pay men and women the same salary for the same job. Of course, in the 21st century, it is a question as to why this is still a hot topic, but it is. So every trial always began with the participant stating his or her own preference on the particular issue. And you'll note that we've created these icons to represent yes and no responses here. And that's because we're going to be recording everybody's responses in this table to the right. So let's say that you said, yes, men and women should be paid the same salary for the same job. You would see your response recorded here, and then you'd have to make a guess for Annie. And let's say that you said Annie said no to this question. You'd find out that you were correct. Annie said no. Then you'd have to make a guess for Betsy. And let's say that you said Betsy said yes. You'd find out that you were indeed correct. Betsy did say yes. And then you'd have to make a guess for Carol. And let's say that you said Carol said no. You'd find out actually you were wrong. Carol said yes in response to this question. So now you'll notice that a row in this table is now complete. So what would happen now is that you, the participant, would restart this process of stating your own preference on a political issue and then guessing and learning the preferences of Annie, Betsy, and Carol for that same political issue. And once you did this for 8 different political issues, you'd be taken to a screen that looks like this, where you're being asked to choose between Annie and Betsy's mystery choices. So the idea here is that you, the participant, have to choose between Annie and Betsy's mystery choices, which are basically, Annie and Betsy have told us, the experimenters, their preferences on a separate political issue, but you as a participant don't know the issue and you don't know the preferences that Annie and Betsy stated, but you did just spend a lot of time learning about Annie and Betsy on these 8 other political issues. So given what you know about Annie and Betsy, with whom would you rather ally with at this point, right? And this is basically our DV here. And so let me just lift the hood a bit on what's going on here by converting this table into a table of 1s and 0s, where 1 represents instances where the agent agrees with you and 0 represents instances where the agent disagrees with you. First, let me just show you that Betsy and Carol agree with each other on 5 out of the 8 issues. And so Carol agrees more with Betsy than with Annie. Second, let me just tally up how often each individual agent agrees with you. And you'll see that Annie and Betsy agree with you on 4 out of the 8 issues. Carol agrees with you on 7. So we can assume that this is basically a high C agreement condition block here. Of course, I could have just as easily made this a low C agreement condition block by making Carol agree with you on only 1 out of the 8 issues. And you'll notice I didn't have to change anything about Annie or Betsy's rate of agreement or preference profiles. And so of course, like I said before, our 2 accounts give diverging hypotheses about how participants will choose on this ally choice trial. So under dyadic similarity, we should see no differences between our 2 conditions as to how often Betsy is chosen over Annie. And that's because, again, the placement of Carol in the agreement space shouldn't affect how we perceive Annie or Betsy. On the other hand, under the latent structured learning account, we should see that participants should be more willing to choose Betsy after high C agreement blocks compared to after low C agreement blocks. And so in our first experiment, we find that indeed participants are inferring and relying on these latent structures. They're more likely to choose Betsy after high C agreement compared to after low C agreement blocks. We then replicate this with a new set of MTurk participants and a new set of political issues. And then we replicate this again a third time with a third set of participants. And in this third experiment, we also ask participants to rate the individual agents on different traits: morality, likability, and competence. And these traits are necessary for social cognition and impression formation. So after each ally choice trial, participants were asked to rate the different agents in a random order on, how likable, competent, and moral they thought each individual was. And the idea here is that if these groupings generalize, then what we should see is that only after high C agreement blocks, that is, conditions when Betsy is in that same latent group as you, only after these blocks should we see that Betsy is being rated as more moral, likable, and competent than Annie. So I'm going to show you the results from that now. And what I have on the y-axis is the difference in ratings between Betsy and Annie. So after high C agreement blocks, we see indeed that participants are rating Betsy as more moral, likable, and competent than Annie. But after low C agreement blocks, we can see that participants are rating Betsy as less moral, less likable, and less competent than Annie. Okay, so far I've shown you that people infer and they use these latent structures and that these structures generalize to our trait assessments about these agents. But I really need to test this account against a strong case of dyadic similarity by showing you that people still use these latent structures despite having an explicit, easy alternative. And I'm going to do that here by creating explicit team assignments that conflict with the latent structure. So at the beginning of each experiment, for each participant, I should say, at the beginning of the experiment, they were assigned to one of two teams, so team orange or team purple. Our example participant here is going to be assigned to team orange. And on each ally choice trial, the participants saw Annie and Betsy's faces framed in these colored frames to denote their own team memberships, right? So Annie here is on team orange and Betsy is on team purple. So Annie's on the same color team, Betsy's on the opposite color team from our participant here. And we structured this task so that Annie was always on the same colored team as the participant, and Betsy was always on the opposite colored team from the participant. And so the idea here is that, if participants stop inferring and relying on these latent structures when they have this easy alternative of explicit team memberships, then we should see that participants should just choose Annie all the time, and we should see no replication of our effect. But we do see a replication. So participants are still more likely to choose Betsy after high C agreement compared to after low C agreement blocks. But that isn't to say that participants are not using these explicit labels, because you can see that none of these bars cross the 50% line. And so what we can conclude from this is that participants here are choosing Annie more than half the time. But now it's the case that when those latent structures are, aligned with the explicit team labels, now participants are even more likely to choose Annie over Betsy, right? So as would be the case in the low C agreement conditions. So across these 4 different behavioral experiments, hopefully I've convinced you that people do infer and rely on latent structures to organize the world or their social worlds into us and them. In the second part, we're going to ask which neural regions track these models. And so an easy candidate for the dyadic similarity model is this ventral region of the medial prefrontal cortex, which includes the pregenial anterior cingulate cortex. And it's very reliably associated with thinking about one's own as well as similar others' traits, mental states, and characteristics. And so it might not be far-fetched to expect that the updating of dyadic similarity and how similar others are to me might also be associated with this area. And so in a similar manner, because latent structures may also rely on tracking similarities between yourself and other agents, it might be the case that perhaps this area might also be associated with tracking probabilities from the latent structure learning model. Our task design was mostly the same as the behavioral task that I showed earlier, with a few changes. The first being that after the end of the learning phase, participants saw in a random order the faces of Annie and Betsy shown in a sequential manner before they reached the ally choice trial. The second big change here is that we set the agreement structure to be the case such that like Carol agrees more with Betsy than with Annie. And Annie and Betsy never agree with one another. And their Annie, Betsy, and Carol's individual rates of agreement with you, the participant, vary. Okay, so just taking us through the different results. First, I'm just going to walk us through the behavioral results. So what I'm going to show you is a smooth level plot of how often participants choose Betsy on that ally choice trial as a function of their agreement with Betsy and their agreement with Carol. So if it is the case that it's all about dyadic similarity and it's all about Betsy's agreement with you, that makes you more likely to choose her on the ally choice trial, then what we should see is this yellow to red gradient going across the horizontal, right? Because regardless of what Carol is doing, the more that Betsy agrees with you, the more you should be to choose her on that ally choice trial. On the other hand, if Carol's rate of agreement with you also matters, then we should see this yellow to red gradient go across the diagonal. And that is indeed what we see. And so participants are choosing Betsy on the ally choice trial as a function of their agreement with Carol and with Betsy. Second, what we can ask is, like, as participants are making guesses about each agent and receiving feedback for these guesses, which voxels in the brain are tracking these updates. And so we're going to be, testing 3 different models here. So our first is dyadic similarity. And this is just going to be operationalized here as the average rate of agreement between yourself, the participant, and the agent under consideration. Our second model we're going to call feature similarity over agents, and this is just basically taking the correlation between the corresponding rows that are constructed from, the rows of a similarity matrix that is constructed from the dyadic similarities that we calculated earlier, right? And so another way to think about this is that if you're trying to estimate your relationship to Betsy, it's not just about your relationship to each individual agent, but you're also taking into consideration how Betsy relates to you, Annie, and Carol. And finally, of course, we have the latent structure learning model, and this is basically going to be the probability that you and a given agent are in the same group, given what you know about them, and this is just going to be calculated as the marginal posterior probability of the relevant partitions. So what we find is that for the dyadic similarity model, we find that the PGACC is indeed tracking this measure of dyadic similarity. And then for feature similarity, we find that the PGACC is also implicated in tracking this feature similarity. But for the latent structure learning model, we find that this right anterior insula that goes into the inferior frontal gyrus, this region is tracking the probabilities from the latent structure learning model. This last result is really interesting because it does overlap with a separately identified ROI. in a separate task where they were asking participants to basically learn about clusters of restaurants and foods that led to bad or good outcomes. And so here what I'm showing is just blue is their cluster and red is ours, and yellow is just the overlap. And so given the difference in the type of judgment that we're making here, that is, in our task, it's social, in this task, it's non-social, we might expect or feel like separate areas of the brain might be recruited for these two judgments, but indeed they actually overlap. Next, we're going to test the specificity of our ROIs. And what we're going to do here is that we're going to calculate a protected exceedance probability. And what this is that this reflects the probability that a model is more frequent in a population compared to other models considered beyond what would be expected by chance. And to just put these results into context, a previous ROC analysis found that the disambiguation threshold, or the point at which we can best discriminate between the hypothesis that like all models are equally represented and the alternative, which is that one model is represented more than another, to be around 0.5 or 50%. And so for the right anterior insula, which is, as you'll recall, what I said earlier was tracking the probabilities from the latent structure learning model, we find that indeed the latent structure model explains more variance in the right AI. But for the PGACC, we find that no single model was especially frequent over the other two in the PGACC. Okay, so in this final analysis, we're going to ask whether or not we can predict choice behavior, because you'll notice that all of my analyses so far have been about the learning phase of the task. And we haven't really, besides the behavioral data, we haven't really dealt with participant choices during the ally choice task. So you can imagine that choice on this particular trial is a function of the model output. But of course, we also have these ROIs that we found from, that we're tracking different forms of similarity and latent structure probability from the learning phase. And if there are downstream effects, then we should see that signal from these areas should affect behavior. So what we're going to do here is that we're going to decode the neural signal from the regions of interest at the time points at which participants are viewing photos of Annie and Betsy. And we're basically going to ask, whether or not adding this neural signal to the model output improves model predictions of choice behavior. And so what we find is that for the two forms of similarity, for the two similarity models, we find that adding the decoded signal does not improve model predictions of choice behavior. On the other hand, for the latent structure learning model, we find that adding the signal from the right AI does improve model predictions of behavior. Okay, and so in this third part of the talk, I'm going to discuss some newer work where we're asking whether or not we can use this latent structure learning model to detect communities in large networks. And so current approaches for detecting communities or groups in social networks, they typically tend to be black box, so they don't produce interpretable output. They're computationally expensive to run, and so they're often not scalable. And they're also reliant on self-report, right? So typically you have to ask participants in the community to self-report their relationships to other people in the community to get a sense of the social network. And furthermore, in terms of quantifying social influence in the network, these approaches usually center around one of two theories, right? So they are either social influence is either localized in homophilous populations, or they need weak ties in order to diffuse, right? And so you get this either or juxtaposition of how people model social influence in networks. And to give you a sense of what we did here, I'm just going to talk quickly about what data we're also working with. So you can imagine that if you provided a person with a smartphone, then with her permission, you could track her usage on that smartphone. So you could get a sense of, who is she calling, how long are her calls, who is she texting, how often does she text, what is her GPS location, and what are her habits around using her smartphone, right? So does she download 5 different messaging apps, or does she download a variety of different types of apps? And you can imagine that if we wanted to predict her behavior at the next time step, we could rely on her behavior at the previous time step to predict her behavior at the current time step, because there is some level of state dependence in our behaviors. If we got a sense of her social network, we could also use the behaviors of her socially connected neighbors to help us predict her behavior at the next time step. Or if we infer latent groups across the network, we could also use the behaviors of her latent group members in order to help predict her behaviors at the next time step. So to walk us through what the framework is doing, recall that what we're always trying to do is to predict behavior at the next time step, and how we're going to do that is through a series of different steps. So in this first step, what we're going to do is that we're going to take all the behaviors at the current time step, and we're going to basically do a distributed inference of groups on smaller sets of agents through latent group inference, through our latent structure learning model. And then we're going to aggregate this into global latent groups. And from these global latent groups, we can derive 2 different statistics. We can calculate the average and the variance of the latent group members' behaviors. And then we're going to combine these 2 statistics with individual attributes to predict behavior. So, what are current behaviors? What are some demographics? And then what are the behaviors of socially connected neighbors? And so what we're going to do is that we're going to use the elastic net, which is just a form of regularization. And that's basically going to help us, select features that are more important for predicting behavior at the next time step. So why use this approach? Well, first of all, we're attempting to move past previous concerns, right? So we don't need relational information, and it's not as computationally expensive to run, and also we have interpretable output. It also allows us to model groups in a slightly more realistic way. So we don't have to rely on static groups based on predetermined characteristics such as age or gender. We also allow groups and their influence to evolve. And we also can allow for loosely and strongly tied groups because, again, our latent groups will vary in terms of their cohesion. And finally, there's no assumption of uniform influence. And so you might imagine that if you knew that everybody else in your group was buying bicycles to ride in the pandemic, that might increase the probability of you taking up bicycle riding in the future. Alternatively, if you knew that if your group had a more diverse set of transport preferences, that might decrease the probability of you taking up bicycle riding in the future. So what we find is that latent groups behaviors are indeed predictive of other future behaviors. This is a lot to take in. I realize that. Let me just say that it's a heat map that is showing you the fitted coefficients for the different latent group average behaviors predicting future behaviors. And let me just zero in on a few squares here. And we can basically see that if the latent group on average calls a lot of different people, this predicts the diversity of people that surround individuals in the future, right? So in other words, if latent groups call a wide variety of distinct individuals, then these people are more likely to find themselves in environments where they're surrounded by more distinct people in the future. On the other hand, something like average call duration of the group negatively predicts geolocation. And so we might interpret this as saying, that call duration actually people with similar call duration habits might also gather in similar areas. What I should also say is that we find that behaviors of socially tied neighbors were not predictive of future behaviors, at least in our particular data set. Okay, so that was a lot. I started off the talk with this question of how do we infer us and them, and then I provided two alternative hypotheses. Hopefully you're convinced by now that a more comprehensive account of social categorization is one in which we infer latent structures in the environment. And these latent structures have consequences because they affect our ally choices. They affect our trait judgments about the agents, and they also exert influence despite explicit group membership information that conflicts with the latent structure. We then looked at the neurocorrelates of social categorization, I should say, and we found that this area of the medial prefrontal cortex, the PGACC, does indeed track different forms of similarity, right? So it tracks and it updates how similar you are to a given individual. But for the latent structure learning model, we find that the right anterior insula tracks the probabilities from this model. We also find that the variability in the right anterior insula is much better explained by the latent structure learning model compared to our two competing models. And we find that adding decoded signal from the right AI actually helps improve model predictions of choice behavior. I then discussed, how we can use this model to detect communities at scale. And then we find that indeed the behaviors of these latent structures are predictive of future behavior. In terms of the bigger picture, what I've basically done here is formalize intuitions that go back to Fritz Heider, who in 1958 proposed balance theory, right? Which basically says that knowing how you feel about a second person and how a second person feels about a third person will affect how you perceive this third person, right? So if you like Homer and you know that Homer doesn't like Mr. Burns, this will affect your perception of Mr. Burns such that you also don't like Mr. Burns. Of course, this latent structure learning model gives us a more quantitative approach to understanding things like balance theory, and it gives us quantifiable predictions as to, well, first it allows us to input quantitative features, but also allows us to make quantifiable predictions about how people will perceive others. And I should just note that computational models are important for a nuanced understanding of psychology because accounts of social processes that can generalize across different contexts require testable and quantifiable predictions. And I should also note that these groups are important, right? Because they allow us to make generalize our predictions about others. And finally, there are implications for other fields. Right. So, so for example, in political science, voter behavior is typically thought to be dependent on voters voting for the candidate with whom their preferences align with the most. And what the latent structure learning model suggests is that voter preferences actually might be a bit more complex than that, right? Where they're taking into account who the other potential candidates are, as well as who are the other potential voting blocks, and understanding how the different blocks and candidates align with each other will affect how the participant or how the voter views their choices. Of course, hopefully I don't have to stretch myself too much to convince you that this model also aligns with current theories about political polarization, such as the idea that we're becoming more sorted, as Lily Mason might put it, and our demographics and where we live are aligning more and more with particular political party lines, right? And so this is driving political polarization. But I should note that the latent structures give us the latent structure learning model gives us interesting insights as to how we might decrease polarization, right? Because decreasing the homogeneity of the political coalitions that we have doesn't necessarily need to decrease the efficacy of the coalition itself, right? Because the latent structured learning model basically dictates that we are doing a context-dependent search for the most probable group. So even though a group may have weaker ties than a homogeneous group, they can still function as a coalition. And so with that, thank you to all of my collaborators on these various projects. Thank you to my funding sources, and thank you so much for listening to this talk. And I'd be happy to take questions at this time. I should also note that data and analyses code are posted on OSF, and you can find the code for the task on my GitHub. Thanks.
Awesome, thanks so much. There are a couple of questions in the Q&A that I can read out loud if you're ready to answer.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, great. So one of the first questions said, when study participants were assessing the morality, likability, and competence of someone else, Betsy, was the participants' view of their own morality, likability, and competence considered as an influential factor in how they rated Betsy?
Oh, interesting. So like, yeah, so I guess the easy answer is that we didn't ask participants about their own morality, likability, and competence. But what one would presume that well, I guess first of all, because I showed you the comparisons between Betsy and Annie there, that shouldn't like how I perceive my own morality, competence, likability, and the starting point for how I rate that, it shouldn't just affect how I rate Betsy, but it should also affect how I rate Annie. And that's part one. Part two is, I guess, just that, like, you would expect that somebody you would expect that people would rate members of their in-group to be more moral, likable, and competent than people who are not in the group.
Great. Okay, I'll go to the next one. The next question we had is, great talk and really well presented. I can see all the really useful and helpful ways that this model could be applied, but I can also see a way that it could be used to, for example, target advertising or news feeds based on what an algorithm can infer that you like/align with. How do you feel about how this could contribute to the echo chambers, even when people are trying to actively avoid them?
Yeah, I think that that's totally a valid point. Just as I try to make this about like diversifying groups at the end, it could also be used to drive people into or solidify, I should say, perceptions or of the existence of certain groups. I guess though my response is that in order to understand how to avoid that, we have to understand how we could even get there to begin with, if that makes sense, right? So like understanding how we infer groups, yes, could lead to what the question just described, but at the same time, it also allows us levers to avoid that. But yes, I am, worried. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, next says, thanks for a great talk. Would you say that the latent structure theory replaces the didactic similarity account, or do people rely both on didactic similarity and on latent social structures simultaneously?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think that actually, as experiment 4 of the behavioral set of studies and the fMRI data show, I think they, one, they track both. And so I think it's not that I'm saying that the latent structure learning account entirely replaces dyadic similarity, but rather it's a more comprehensive account of how we infer coalitional members. And you could imagine that maybe if we had asked, if the DV had been something slightly different, you know, think about who like also likes the same flavor of ice cream as you or something like that. With the, you know, that decoded signal from the PGAC might have helped to improve predictions on that particular behavior. And so I think it's a question of people, what the problems that people are trying to solve that are going to dictate which you know, model they might rely on more. But for inferring us and them, I guess, yeah, I would argue that the latent structure learning account is a more comprehensive account of the process.
Okay, I think we've got time for these last two questions. How was the latent group identified in the last real life network example?
Yeah, and so basically what we did there is that we did a distributed, I realized I should have made like better graphics, but we did a distributed inference across the whole network. So we basically took like smaller subsets of agents and we calculated what the probability of them being in the same group was, right? So that the same statistic that I described for the fMRI study. And so we do this for different groups of randomly selected agents in the, or different nodes, if you will, in the network. And then we basically aggregate these. We aggregate these and then we infer like global latent groups by running, by basically running like a separate clustering process on that. But yeah.
And right after that, somewhat related to the first question at the beginning of the talk about how your own thoughts about yourself and your own morality affect your thoughts about Betsy. The question says, I imagine that the degree to which participants care about a given issue may influence how similar they perceive themselves to be to Betsy and Annie. For example, Annie and Betsy are equally similar to me, but objectively, Betsy is similar to me on issues I deem more important. What do you think about this and how it may be implemented in your approach and model? Thank you for a wonderful and thought-provoking talk.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Right, so we did not measure, you know, we didn't have participants rank how important different political issues were to them beforehand. If we had done that, we probably could have incorporated it into the model. That said, I should say that, you know, Annie, Betsy, and Carol's preferences were randomly assigned to, in a random manner to like different political issues. And so if there was some play of certain issues being more important to me than others, then across the whole sample, we shouldn't have seen, you know, the 4 replications that we did across like all of our experiments. But that said, to answer the last part of this question, you know, you can imagine that you could potentially, you know, rate similarity on certain issues to be slightly more important, like weight them a little bit more in terms of when you're determining which groupings are most probable. And so this would affect the probabilities of the probabilities of the different groupings that you get, if that makes sense. Sorry, it's hard not doing this live.
Yeah, it's definitely a different experience.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. And just a reminder, I just posted the link where we'll move right after this once we sign off to the Q&A in the Growing Up in Science chat. And thank you so much again for the wonderful presentation.
Yeah, thank you. And please do email me if you have any other questions.